Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk. Standards everywhere. What standards should really mean in an API world. I'm Chris Wood. I'm a freelance consultant, but most importantly for today's speech, I'm a writer on the Nordic APIs blog. I've done blog posts on there for about the last 9 years. I'm not going to go full Troy McClure on you and list all the blog posts that I've written, but there's kind of a common theme in what interests me, partly driven by the project work that I do and where I've worked in the industry. And that is, I'm quite interested in standards. And those standards are standards for open blah, 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 blah. So what do I mean by open blah, blah, blah? Well, fill blah, blah, blah in with banking, finance, energy, logistics, travel, essentially standards that relate to creating API ecosystems based on standardized APIs. Now, you might be wondering, well, that doesn't sound very exciting, but actually the standards landscape is continually evolving. You'll see just dotted around the edge of the slide, there's a bunch of different standards bodies that exist to help create what are effectively templates for APIs. Now, why are these templates important? Well, the ecosystems that the standards bodies are trying to build, essentially we want cookie cutter APIs that can help us just get API providers to get the right APIs in the market to achieve the goals of the ecosystem. So just to give you a quick example, open banking is largely driven throughout the world by regulation from banks and governing bodies. They want the banks to implement APIs based on the regulations so that they can actually expand the market to new entrants. Good things about that: financial inclusion, allowing more competition, looking for new business models, so on and so forth. So essentially using APIs as a driver for the expanding the economy. So if open standards for banking and finance are important, then we need some things in order to support us. Okay, so these kind of standards do a couple of things. Number one is they create consistency for API consumers. So in the guise of, for example, open banking, your API consumer is likely to be a fintech or a third-party provider who's giving their customers something they're building on top of banking data or the ability to make a payment on behalf of that customer. In order to create a market where those fintechs can compete effectively, government and regulatory bodies are essentially saying, let's make sure that those API consumers can operate based on APIs that are the same at every bank they go to. That then allows them to go and sell products to their customers that take that data and do something special with it. So having that consistency allows API consumers to operate in that market in a much more effective way. And this kind of then creates the second effect, which is we're starting to level the playing field. We're making sure that where access to data like banking data is important, we make sure that everybody can do the same thing. So the special thing isn't the fact the API is there. Everybody can compete based on the same capabilities in the market, based on the same APIs. So, that then goes some way to helping with fostering innovation, fostering new entrants to the market by creating a level playing field. And finally, it gives time for more interesting things. If a bank is implementing APIs based on a regulation, they just want to get the job done. They don't want to put a full process in place of doing extended design. Actually, picking up an open standard and just getting the job done actually gives them time for more interesting things. Rather than meeting regulations, they can go and pursue their own objectives. So there's a good few reasons why these standards are coming to existence. There's a good few reasons why they're important. You can agree or disagree about the role of government and regulation and all the rest of it as to how that fosters new ecosystems and whether they should be intruding in the market or not. But the fact of the matter, all those movements are here. I was actually quite pleased to see on that uptick on the Gartner slide, open banking was up on the slope of enlightenment or something or other. It sounded positive to me, but you know, the open ecosystems that are being built based on standards are here to stay, and whether you like them or you don't like them, you know, those markets are only going to grow and get bigger, and the role of standards in these markets is only going to grow and get bigger. There is one problem, though, from us as API people. No one ever said that implementing APIs based on standards is great. Now, you know, let's make sure we're clear on the context. This is in the context of open banking, open finance, open energy, open whatever. But there is a problem with standards developer experience, in my opinion. And I'm going to give you a bit of a worked example. The worked example is around the open banking in the European Union. And this is concerned with a wonderfully titled piece of legislation called Payment Services Directive 2, or PSD2. Because it is a directive and it comes from the centre of the European Union, it has to be implemented in local law. What it says is banks must make data available in the market to third-party participants who are not banks, so they can sell their products to customers. Because it's a directive, every single European Union territory has gone and done something slightly different. So what we've ended up with in all these territories in the EU is either slightly different standards or slightly different implementations. Shown on screen there are 3 standards bodies that were created as a result of PSD2. So open banking, that's in the UK, which is no longer in the EU, obviously, but we still had to abide by PSD2. STET is in France. Berlin Group comes from Germany. All these guys face off to another wonderfully snappily titled set of standards, ISO 222. So they pick pieces out of that and they pull them into their standards in order to cut down the legwork of doing redesign. They're just using industry standards to create the models around artifacts in both accounts data and payments data. So you've got multiple new standards, but the same developer experience deal for people who are actually implementing them. So example number 1, this is the Berlin Group. And we've heard this over the last few days, yesterday even, about the quality of documentation that you might provide via your API portal or whatever. But the Berlin Group, they publish their standards in one long PDF, and all the endpoints are in there, the methods, the data attributes. It's enormous. I mean, it's classic financial services stuff. People do this all the time. Organizations do this all the time. But it's basically rules written up longhand, aimed at humans to go and digest and then use. In the UK, we've swapped the PDF for HTML, which gives us some better indexing and searching, but there's still lots of detail. There's still this need to transpose all this information into the implementation. Now, we did get, praise be, API descriptions. The standards bodies provide them. They're encoded in Open API. They're very helpful, but they're not a first-class citizen in terms of how the standards bodies publish this information. They're useful. They're really useful as a template. You can take them and do things with them. You can generate code, server implementation code, whatever, right? But the standards bodies don't generally take them as seriously as they do their long PDFs or massive HTML documents. I'll give you an example. In the UK, the Open API document is allowed to change after the HTML page with all those rules has been published, and it can change on multiple occasions, and typically it's got bugs in it. So that gives you a view of why it needs to be taken more seriously as an artifact generated by the standards body. Also, based on day one, is there a problem of complexity here? You know, we've heard from various people, the Rust guy, Alex, about how complex Open API can be. Is there a need to simplify how this is done? So what's the root of the problem? Well, in all these standards documents, we've got lots of verbiage. It needs to be transposed to code. That process tends to be very inefficient. We are kind of stuck with this process of involving multiple people, developers, analysts, etc., in order to take that and turn it into an implementation of the API. This decreases the enablement ecosystem because it just takes so long to get the damn thing finished. So, another snappily titled standard regulation is coming, PSD3. PSD2 clearly wasn't good enough. PSD3 is coming. One of the main things that's in the opinions on PSD3, which is going to be another regulation about sharing account data and payment services in Europe, is there must be a common standard for APIs across the European Union, and this time excluding the UK, unfortunately, but I won't dwell on that. Is there any means that we can make standards-based APIs easier to implement? So, first off is take the API description side of it seriously. You know, put some craft into how that API description is created, put some craft into ensuring that if you are going to publish documentation, that one and the other reflect each other in fine detail. There's plenty of options also in terms of what's the most effective way of describing an API. I've put a bunch on the screen there. The standards body should actually be looking and saying, what's the most effective way for these APIs to create API descriptions that the community wants to use and has the tool sets that they can readily lay their hands on so that they can then do the job as efficiently as possible. So that's kind of number one. Can this be done better in the next iteration of the standards that's going to be driven by PSD3? The next thing is about a new nascent standard called Workflows by the Open API Initiative. So this is like brand spanking new. It's a release candidate at the moment. It's called Open API Workflows. That's not its official title. It's still undergoing naming. But what it does is it allows you to codify like sequences of API calls across different APIs or within the same API. And from the open banking perspective, this is quite, or what will come open finance, this is quite important because we're going to have stuff that exists in those long PDF documents that we could actually express in a description using something like an Open API workflow document. So we can actually provide rules for sequencing API calls. One good example is where a third party goes and accesses an account and they need customer consent first. You always need the order of customer consent is created. You go and do some OIDC or OAuth stuff, and then you, based on the result of that, you then go and create an actual payment resource or you access the account. So actually codifying those sequences so it's easier to implement and easier to describe by the standards bodies, that would be really cool because then you take away some of the legwork in terms of creating the implementation in code. The final thing, you probably guessed I might say something about this, is what role can AI play here? I mean, loads has been said in the summit already. I don't pretend to be an expert or whatever, but the thing I've picked up is can we make AI deterministic enough that standards bodies can use it as a means to get implementers on board with what the standards mean, how they work, and do it in a way that it can be deterministic and actually describe accurately the requirements of an implementer of a standard. So just for a bit of fun, you know, because I was bored one afternoon, I went and had a chat with ChatGPT about the UK Open Banking Standard and the Berlin Group Standard. And I was doing it from the perspective of being a developer, creating a client to access these things. So the first screenshot was me saying, give me a JavaScript client based on Axios to do a payment initiation request. It did a fairly decent job of giving me that information. Obviously, I'm looking at it from the client perspective, not the implementer's perspective, but I was just curious to see how it would react. It did a good job. I know that standard reasonably well. It looks and smells rather like an implementation of a client for the UK open banking standards. I then asked the Berlin Group standards for their open finance version of this same request. Their open finance is version 2 of the Berlin Group standards. It gave me a response that basically said, this is the way you do it, but everything in the response was to do with their version 1 of the standard. Essentially, that isn't in their corpus of knowledge at the moment, because that's only just come out. It's not been ingested by ChatGPT. Yes, I could shoehorn that big PDF document in and get a better answer, but having the systematic approach to actually do that stuff needs to be led by the standards body, so that chatting stops being just chatting and then becomes an attestation of compliance with the standard. So, this leads me to say, can there be such a thing as a large language model or GPT for standards? Because then we can help implementers do their job more effective and more quickly and get to that point of enabling ecosystems based on standards. So, just to conclude, the future of standards developer experience, I mean, I don't know whether this is going to manifest itself or not, but what I'd like to see is some real considered choices about API descriptions and how standards body craft those. In the middle, open API workflow or something equivalent, expanding the description, providing more information that's codified so that it can be consumed by tool sets and allow people to more readily implement the standards. And then a GPT for standards or something that can help reduce the legwork. It's got to be sufficiently deterministic. We're going to have to work hard to narrow the scope so that we get effective responses from it. By the way, the icon, I asked ChatGPT to generate that for me, and frankly, I won't be sacking the graphic design department anytime soon. So that's it. Thanks for listening. If you want to get hold of me and talk about standards or anything, there I am on LinkedIn, Instagram, and by email.